You're chained in the hull of a ship. The smell of rotten fish burns your throat. You can't see anything, only hear the water hitting the wood and the moans of other women around you. 6 days ago, you were praying in the monastery of Lindisfarne. 6 days ago, you were a consecrated virgin, promised to God, protected by your faith. That protection turned out to be an illusion. The men from the north arrived with the dawn fog. They slaughtered the monks on the same altars where they had prayed for decades, slit their throats while they begged for mercy, looted the gold, burned the sacred manuscripts. But with you, they did something different. They didn't kill you. They chained you, dragged you to the beach, ripped off your habit in front of everyone to verify your age and physical condition. You're 15 years old, and you just discovered that in the northern lands, there's a special category of slave. It's called Frilla Christina, Christian captive, preferably a nun, preferably a virgin. Because for the Vikings, there's no greater victory over the Christian God than turning his consecrated virgins into permanent concubines. The ship moves north. Norway is 3 weeks of sailing away. And what awaits you when you arrive? The Catholic Church will spend the next 1,000 years trying to erase it from official history. This is the story of the 23 nuns captured at Lindisfarne in the year 793, what marks the beginning of the Viking Age. And the most terrifying part isn't what they did to them, it's that no one saved them. Not the Christian kings, not the bishops, not even the parents who handed them over to the monastery, believing they'd be protected. Everyone knew what the Vikings did with captives, and everyone stayed silent. If this story grips you, drop a like and subscribe. It takes a second and helps us keep unearthing the voices the world chose to silence. But before you understand what the Vikings did to these women, you need to understand what they lost that morning. June 8th, 793 AD, dawn. The island of Lindisfarne sits off the coast of Northumbria, England. It's one of the holiest sites in all of Christendom. Home to the relics of St. Cuthbert, a place where monks have prayed and copied sacred texts for over 150 years. The monastery houses 47 monks, 23 nuns, and treasures accumulated over generations. Gold chalices, silver crosses, manuscripts illuminated with covers encrusted in precious gems, reliquaries containing the bones of saints. The monks had heard rumours, pagans from the north attacking coastal villages, but Lindisfarne was sacred ground, protected by God himself. That morning the fog was thick. The watchman on the tower saw nothing until it was too late. 30 ships, dragon heads carved on their prows, emerging from the grey mist like ghosts from a nightmare. By the time the alarm bells rang, the Vikings were already on the beach. They didn't negotiate, didn't demand surrender, didn't even pause to assess the situation. They simply attacked. The first monks who ran toward the beach to greet what they thought were traders died with their hands raised in welcome. Axes split their skulls before they could understand what was happening. The Vikings moved with terrifying efficiency. They'd done this before. They knew exactly what they wanted and exactly where to find it. Some headed for the church, others for the treasury, others for the dormitories. The monks who tried to resist were cut down instantly. The monks who tried to flee were hunted through the cloisters. The monks who hid were dragged from their hiding places and executed in the courtyard. Father Aldwin the abbot was found kneeling before the altar, praying. They decapitated him where he knelt. His blood splashed across the same stones where he'd celebrated Mass for 30 years. The whole attack lasted less than 4 hours. By noon, Lindisfarne was silent. 47 monks, dead, every single one. But the 23 nuns, they were still alive, and that's when their nightmare truly began. The Vikings didn't take women randomly. They had a system. To understand why they captured nuns specifically, you need to understand Scandinavian social structure in the 8th century. In Norse societies, women actually had more rights than in the rest of Europe. They could inherit property, divorce their husbands, participate in trade, but there was also a particular institution called thrall, slavery, and within slavery there were specific categories. Common thralls did agricultural or domestic work, but there was a special category called ambat, female slaves who also functioned as permanent concubines. And within that category, the most valued were frilla Christina, Christian slaves, especially nuns. The reason was twofold. First, religious humiliation. The Vikings, devoted pagans who worshipped Odin and Thor, found special satisfaction in profaning what Christians considered most sacred. A nun had taken vows of eternal chastity. She had promised her virginity to Christ. Claiming her as property was the supreme insult to the Christian God, a demonstration that Norse gods were more powerful. Second, practical economics. Nuns were educated women, rare in that era. They could read and write in Latin, some in Greek. They knew medicinal herbs, sophisticated weaving techniques, basic accounting. As slaves, they had multiple uses: domestic, reproductive, intellectual. So on that beach at Lindisfarne, while smoke rose from the burning monastery, the Vikings began their selection. They stripped the nuns naked, examined them like livestock at market, checked teeth, inspected skin for diseases, estimated ages. Abbess Elfrida, 52 years old, was deemed too old to be useful. Her throat was cut on the spot. Her blood soaked into the same sand where her sisters knelt, watching. The remaining 22 women were sorted. The youngest and most attractive, approximately 8 of them, were designated for a ritual the Vikings called blodband, blood marriage. The older or less attractive ones were assigned as common ambat, domestic slaves with other obligations. 1. Novice, a girl named Hilda, according to a fragmented 9th century manuscript, was only 15 years old. She would become one of the 8 chosen for blood marriage. None of them understood what that meant. They would learn. The 3-week voyage to Norway wasn't just transportation, it was psychological warfare. The Vikings didn't touch the nuns immediately after capturing them. Not on the ships, at least not the ones destined for blood marriage. They kept them chained in the cargo holds, dark, humid spaces that smelled of rotten fish and salt water. They fed them scraps, mouldy bread, dried fish so salty it burned the throat. They forced them to urinate and defecate where they sat. No privacy, no cleaning. It was systematic depersonalization, a process to break the identity they'd built over years of monastic life. The warriors visited them regularly, not to violate them, not yet, to humiliate them in other ways. They forced them to pronounce blasphemies against Christ, cut their hair, which the nuns kept long under their veils as a symbol of consecrated femininity, and threw it into the sea, made them drink strong beer until they vomited, breaking their vows of sobriety. They forced them to witness pagan sacrifices, where Vikings slaughtered animals and sprinkled the blood over wooden idols carved to represent Thor and Freya. Every act was designed to demonstrate that their god didn't protect them, that their vows meant nothing, that their identity as brides of Christ was an illusion that could be destroyed. Modern psychologists have a term for this: learned helplessness. In the 1960s, researcher Martin Seligman discovered that when subjects learned nothing they could change their situation, they stopped trying. They surrendered. Not from weakness, but because their brains were trying to protect them from madness. First you fight. Then you realize fighting doesn't work. Then you stop fighting. Then you stop feeling. The nuns in those shipholds were being systematically broken. Not through violence, not yet, but through degradation, isolation and uncertainty that never ended. By the time they reached Norway, most had already surrendered inside. That was the point. What you're about to see is so disturbing that the Catholic Church spent centuries destroying every document that mentioned it. Subscribe. Because Crown and Dagger doesn't hide from history's darkest chapters. When the ships finally reached the Norwegian coast, probably some fjord near the Hordaland region, the next phase of the system began. The nuns were unloaded and taken to what the Norse called thralahus, slave houses, wooden structures where captives were processed before final distribution. There they were washed for the first time in weeks, not out of compassion, because Vikings valued basic cleanliness in their property. They were examined by older Norse women, experts in evaluating fertility, dental health, signs of disease, physical strength. Based on these evaluations, the nuns were classified. The 8 youngest and most attractive were prepared for bloodband, blood marriage. This was a complex ritual documented in the Icelandic sagas. Though the sagas generally omit the most brutal details, it occurred during Blot, a Viking religious festival celebrated 3 times per year. The captive was brought to the Hörgra, a pagan stone altar usually located in a forest clearing considered sacred. She was naked, hands tied behind her back. The Jarl or Hersir, the local leader claiming her, stood before her dressed in ceremonial armour. Between them, a Godi, a pagan priest, performed the ceremony. The Godi sacrificed a horse, an animal sacred to Odin. He collected the blood in a bronze bowl and mixed it with fermented mead. He forced the captive to drink the mixture while reciting invocations to Freya and Frigg, goddesses associated with fertility and marriage. Then the Jarl cut his own palm with a ritual knife and forced the captive to do the same. They pressed their bleeding palms together while the Godi bound them with a leather cord, creating a blood bond that, according to Norse beliefs, united their spirits permanently. The final part of the ritual was public and brutal. The Jarl claimed the captive on the stone altar while the community watched. It wasn't an act of passion, it was a religious ceremony. Spectators chanted hymns to Freya, beat shields rhythmically, drank mead. When it was over, he marked her forehead with her blood, claiming her as his Frilla. The complete ceremony could last several hours, depending on how many additional rituals the Godi deemed necessary. For the nuns of Lindisfarne, this ritual was total destruction of their previous identity. They had spent years, some decades, cultivating spiritual purity. They had memorized psalms, fasted, flagellated their own bodies to suppress carnal desires. Their entire lives were built around virginity as sacrament. Now that virginity was torn away in a pagan ceremony, specifically designed to profane what they considered most sacred, many tried to resist, screaming prayers in Latin, invoking the Virgin Mary. But the Vikings interpreted that resistance as evidence the ritual was working, that they were breaking the power of the Christian God over these women. After the blood marriage, the life of a Frilla Christina followed established patterns. She lived in her master's house, generally in a separate room from the legitimate wife, but within the same family complex. She belonged to him completely, available whenever he desired, without the right to refuse. But she also had domestic obligations, weaving, cooking, caring for children, working in the gardens. The nuns, with their literacy skills, were frequently assigned additional tasks, keeping trade records, teaching the family's children, preparing herbal medicines. Pregnancies were inevitable and frequent. Vikings valued fertility. They believed many children ensured family prosperity. A Frilla who became pregnant received no special treatment, no rest. She worked until the moment of birth, gave birth assisted only by other slaves, returned to work days later. Babies born to Frilla had ambiguous status. They weren't automatically slaves, but they weren't free either. The master could decide to recognize them as legitimate children, convert them to slaves, or expose them. A Norse practice where unwanted babies were left in the forest to die. The nuns, who had spent years in cloister, protected from all male contact, now faced repeated pregnancies that destroyed their bodies. Without prior knowledge of childbirth, without mental preparation, many died in the process. Those who survived frequently developed obstetric fistulas, internal injuries that caused permanent incontinence. There was no corrective surgery in the 8th century. These women lived the rest of their lives with constant pain and suffering they could never escape. But what perhaps most completely destroyed the nuns wasn't the physical abuse. It was the forced spiritual corruption. The Vikings weren't content with claiming their bodies. They wanted to convert them, make them abandon Christianity and embrace the Norse gods. They forced them to participate in blot, sacrifices where they had to help slaughter animals and sprinkle blood on idols. They made them pronounce vows to Freya, asking for fertility in children. They made them learn songs in Old Norse that celebrated Viking conquests and mocked the crucified god. Some nuns resisted for years, praying the rosary in secret, tracing crosses in the air when no one was watching. But the psychological pressure was immense. Their captors constantly ridiculed them, asking where their Christ was now, why he didn't rescue them. If their virginity had been so important, why did their God allow it to be stolen? Over time, especially after years of captivity and multiple pregnancies, many began to doubt. Some convinced themselves they had been abandoned by God, that their vows were no longer valid, that they had to adapt to survive. The process was facilitated by Viking legitimate wives, who frequently developed complex relationships with their husbands' frillers. Some wives saw the Christian slaves as threats and treated them with extreme cruelty, beating them, burning them with hot irons, forcing them to perform the most degrading tasks. Others developed something like camaraderie, recognizing that both were victims of the same patriarchal system, though at different levels. These wives occasionally helped the friller, teaching them Norse customs, protecting them from the worst punishments, even allowing them to keep hidden Christian symbols. A fragment preserved in a monastery library mentions a nun called Edgith. Historians believe this was Hilda's full Christian name. She was 15 when captured at Lindisfarne. She gave birth 7 times in captivity. Only 2 children survived. She never stopped praying. Every night, in silence, she whispered the Pater Noster while her master slept. When she died at 34, worn out by pregnancies and labour, her master buried her with a small wooden cross she had carved in secret. He had converted to Christianity 3 years earlier. Because of her, some nuns tried to commit suicide. It was mortal sin according to Catholic doctrine, but hell seemed preferable to the life they endured. They hanged themselves with leather cords when they had opportunity, threw themselves into frozen fjords during winter, ingested poisonous berries they found in the forests. But Vikings had developed techniques to prevent suicides in valuable slaves. They watched them constantly, kept them slightly malnourished to reduce their physical strength, and brutally punished any failed attempt. A slave who tried to kill herself was publicly whipped, sometimes until she lost consciousness, as a warning to others. Historical records about the specific fate of the Lindisfarne nuns are fragmentary. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles mention the attack, but say little about the captives. A 9th century Irish manuscript, written by a monk named Alcuin of York, laments the profanation of consecrated virgins, but gives no details. Only in the Icelandic sagas, written centuries later, do indirect references appear. The Íslendinga saga mentions a Christian friller named Hildigunna, who knew how to read Latin and taught Christian runes to her master's children. The Egil saga speaks of an English slave who secretly maintained her faith and eventually converted her master to Christianity before dying. Were these women in the sagas the nuns of Lindisfarne? Impossible to know with certainty, but the chronology matches. The sagas were transmitted orally for generations before being written down, preserving distorted memories of real events. It's plausible that some of the 23 nuns captured in 793 lived decades in captivity, had Viking children and grandchildren, and were eventually remembered vaguely in stories that mixed facts with legends. What we do know with certainty is that the pattern repeated hundreds of times over the next 250 years of the Viking Age. The monastery of Iona in Scotland was attacked in 802, 806 and 825, each time with nuns captured. The monastery of Kildare in Ireland was raided. In 835, the nuns taken as slaves. Monasteries in France, Germany, even as far south as Spain, faced similar attacks. Vikings developed a specific preference for coastal monasteries because they combined three objectives: wealth in gold and manuscripts, absence of significant military defences, and presence of nuns and monks who could be enslaved. The final irony is devastating. These women, victims of pagan violence designed to humiliate Christianity, probably contributed more to the Christianization of Scandinavia than any missionary. They taught their mixed children about Christ, kept the faith alive in secret for decades. When Viking kings finally began converting to Christianity in the 10th century, many did so influenced by mothers, grandmothers, and concubines who had preserved those beliefs despite the horror they had suffered. St. Bridget of Kildare, whose monastery was raided multiple times, supposedly prayed that any nun captured by pagans would find strength to maintain her faith in secret and eventually convert her captors. If those prayers were answered, it was in ways the saint never would have imagined, through violation, slavery, and decades of suffering that slowly eroded pagan beliefs from within. The Vikings thought that by capturing and enslaving nuns they were demonstrating the superiority of their gods. But the seeds of Christianity, planted involuntarily in their homes, brought in the wombs of violated women, eventually grew until they completely consumed the ancient Norse religion. By the 12th century, there were no pagans left in Scandinavia. The temples of Odin were destroyed, the priests converted or killed, the sagas rewritten with Christian influences. Final victory, bitter and bloody, achieved on the bodies of women who never asked to be martyrs. In 2015, archaeologists excavating a Viking site in the Orkney Islands found a woman's grave. She was buried with a strange mix of objects: a Christian crucifix and a Thor's hammer, both placed on her chest. Isotope analysis of her teeth revealed she had grown up in the British Isles, but lived most of her adult life in Scandinavia. She had evidence of multiple healed bone fractures consistent with domestic violence, and she had given birth at least 6 times. The archaeologists believe she was probably a nun or Christian woman captured young, enslaved for decades, and eventually buried with symbols of both religions, reflecting the fractured identity that captivity had imposed on her. The nuns of Lindisfarne, and thousands like them from other raided monasteries, have no names in history. There are no tombstones commemorating them, no saints' days dedicated to their memory. The Catholic Church, ashamed of its inability to protect them, preferred to forget them. The Viking sagas remember them only as footnotes, nameless slaves who fulfilled domestic functions, but their bones are in the earth of Scandinavia. Their DNA runs in the veins of millions. Their fragmented and distorted stories persist in legends and folklore. They deserve to be remembered, not only as passive victims, but as women who survived unimaginable horrors, maintained fragments of identity and faith in impossible circumstances, and unknowingly planted the seeds that would eventually transform their captors. Their suffering was real, their resistance was heroic, and their story was deliberately erased for centuries by an ashamed church and a romanticised Viking culture. Remembering them honestly is the only tribute we can still offer. This is Crown and Dagger. We don't sanitise history. We show you what actually happened. Because the past isn't dead. It's waiting in the dark, waiting for someone to remember. If you want more stories the world tried to bury, hit subscribe. And drop a comment. What other dark historical truths should we uncover?